The exit light, a hovering beacon set in darkened places to inform you there is always a way out. But don't go just yet. We have such wonderful things to show you. Welcome to the Exit Light Podcast. Hello, and thank you for listening once again to the Exit Light Podcast. I'm your host, Eli Beals, and for the time being, all stories and narrations are done by myself until such a time as I have more collaborators, you might say. I will definitely give them full and due credit where it is deserved. That being said, on with the show. You could say Hans Boltzmann had a green thumb. Nearly every free moment he had was spent tending to the plant life that won him the admiration and perhaps a little jealousy from his peers and neighbors. To say the least, he was very proud of his garden, but he was most attentive to his lawn, and would gladly tell you, when asked, that it was zoysia, the softest of lawn grass. On any given sunny weekend day, you would find him pushing his old reel trimmer around, the kind without a motor. He detested motorized ones, claiming the fumes from the gasoline poisoned the grass, and besides, he enjoyed it. If kids, or heaven forbid, a dog stepped a foot or paw on this sacred lawn, you could count on him emerging from his house with his fist raised, yelling in fury to chase them off. To say that he was protective of his immaculate yard was an understatement. He would peer through the curtains before heading off to bed, just to look at his lawn in the moonlight. The sight of the evenly clipped grass, illuminated by a full moon, was perhaps his favorite sight to see. One night, during a new moon, he glanced out at his lawn in near total darkness to see a faint glow in the middle of his yard. Like a lone firefly nestled between the manicured blades, he thought it odd that there would just be one, and that this was Northern California, and fireflies were not native to this region. Puzzled, but not overly curious, he went to bed, and thought nothing more of it. He dreamt of a vast and endless chasm, a space so large and empty he could not discern its boundaries. His voice did not even echo when he called out, but he knew that something else was there, stirring like a bottomless ocean beneath him. As he left for work the next morning, his eyes strayed to the center of his lawn, wondering what it was he saw last night that compelled such a strange and terrifying dream. There was nothing there, just beautiful, vivid green grass. The days and weeks passed without incident, until it was yet again as dark as can be in the night sky, where the reflected light of the sun was completely obscured, and that all that was visible of the moon was a void in the starscape. Just as before, he saw a faint eldritch light in the center of his yard, and this time he went out to inspect. As soon as his slippered foot touched the grass, the light went out. Whatever it was, he thought, was aware of his presence. He went back inside and watched the lawn for almost an hour before heading off to bed, sleepy. Though the light did not return, the dream, however, did. This time, there was a sound, a low tone that resonated with his very bones and marrow, transmitting intent of such immense malevolence and power that he just went numb and awoke in a cold sweat. Stumbling to the living room, he looked again at his lawn. The light was there, and it was brighter than he recalled, emitting a pulsing light that washed all existence in his view in green. Not bright exactly, but more like a film, covering his eyes like a thick, viscous oil. Hans could not sleep the rest of the night, and just lay in bed, dreading that place he dared not return, not even in dreams. The subsequent days and weeks went by as usual. No abyssal dreams, no lights in his beloved lawn, but he knew the new moon would bring them again, something he had come to desperately dread. Tonight, however, he would be prepared. He camped out on his lawn, armed with a flashlight and a pair of hedge clippers, and waited for the sun to sink below the horizon. Sure enough, as the sky deepened to a pitch black, he saw that light again. It was a glowing tendril that emerged just between his feet like a beanstalk sprouting from a pod. It curled and waved slowly, as if submerged in water like a sea anemone. He could hardly breathe as he observed it, wondering in pure amazement what it could possibly be. Never in his years had he seen anything like it, and it was ruining his calm. This thing had imposed upon him a sense of being invaded, in both waking and dreaming states. He steeled himself to pounce upon it and sever it like an encroaching weed that it was. Quietly, silently, he inched the shears close to the tentacle that swayed in its invisible current. It reached out, extending ever so slightly more, reaching for the sky like a beckoning finger, and he jabbed at it with a swift metallic slice. He clipped it just beneath the soil's surface, and immediately, miles below his feet, he felt, more than he heard, the scream. It rumbled through the stria and tectonic plates of the earth, and Hans's mouth went completely dry. Rage, like nothing he had ever known, was transmitted through this tiny breach in his beloved lawn, and then it was quiet. Hans waited a moment, and then a few moments more. Satisfied, he clicked on his flashlight. The brightness of it caused him to wince, and took a while before he could see the spot where he had cut into whatever it was. Nothing was there aside from the wound he had inflicted upon his lawn. Just a small clod of turf and a divot in the ground. He would patch it tomorrow, he thought, as he climbed into bed, tired. And for the first time in months, Hans Boltzmann slept soundly. Carl was a commercial lumberman, and he was both pleased and a little disappointed that his son Roland wanted to follow in his footsteps. To be a lumberjack like his dad. He loved his job, and enjoyed being in the woods. He never tired of the smell of fresh-cut lumber or the sound a tree made when it fell. He found the whole experience quite romantic. But He wanted more for his son, as most fathers do. He would admonish Roland about how hard the work was, and he should temper his expectations and perhaps explore other things. But like him, his kid was determined, and so one day he decided to give a practical lesson. They drove up to their cabin where Carl would fish and hunt. All the implements of such activities adorned the small structure. He thought he might do some fishing, depending on how long the lesson lasted, of course. When he was a teenager, his father had caught him smoking and sat him down in the back patio, making him smoke an entire pack of cigarettes. He was so sick and never touched another cigarette again. Perhaps that was a little extreme, Carl thought, but the principle was the same here. He grabbed a wood axe, one that he used to split logs, making sure the edge was sharp by scraping his thumbnail with it. It could probably use a bit of honing, he thought, but it would do. He handed it to Roland, and they hiked a quarter-mile away up a hill that commanded a stunning view of the lake and his cabin. At the top of this hill stood a tall Quercus velutina, or black oak tree. He patted his son on the shoulder and told him to get to work, and to make sure to stand away from the cut before it would fall, lest he get squished. Roland looked up at him, jaw set in determination, eyes serious, and replied, "Okay, Dad." Carl watched him take a few swings that barely chipped the dark gray bark and went back to the cabin. It wasn't long before Roland realized he wasn't going to be able to cut this thing down. The axe was too heavy, and he already had a painful blister on his right palm between his thumb and forefinger. He wasn't going to give up. He wanted his dad to be proud of him, and so he kept at it, until he was drenched in sweat and exhaustion. He looked down at the cabin, then back at the oak tree and sighed. He had cut through the bark and about a half an inch into the hard wood. He leaned the axe against the tree and walked over to a large rock and sat in its shade, just glowering at the tree. He needed to sit here a while and regain his strength. He wasn't planning on taking a nap, but the weather was warm and the grass was soft, and before he knew it, he was drifting off.
Good. The little shit is asleep. How dare he try and cut me down? I've been around much longer than that sack of meat. Hope a mountain lion finds him here. What's this? He left his axe here. Such a sharp axe with a wood handle. How ironic that an implement to cut us down is made from our flesh. Save for the cursed metal that bites, but so beautiful at the same time. Maybe I will throw it into the lake? It feels nice in my grasp. A wonderful shape, really. A seductive weight to it, and the way the light shines on its deadly curve. Perhaps I will take a practice swing before throwing it into the water. Oh, nicked myself. Ouch, that stung a bit. If it goes into the water, it will rust and no longer be beautiful. It is dangerous. It should be turned to rust. No, I can't do it. They will just come back with bigger axes and saws. That's what they do. Such cruel devices, and yet imbued with purpose, and, well, very useful to the ones who wield them. I won't throw it into the lake, but I want to hold it still. I wonder. Oh, that pain! It shakes me so. Perhaps another. I have never felt such exhilaration, such red lust. This pain is also pleasure, and I cannot stop. I'm almost falling now. I am tired. I will lie down with you now, my love, my destroyer.
When Roland awoke, he saw the fallen tree and gasped. After a few moments he frowned, thinking perhaps his father had found him asleep, and then did his work for him as some kind of joke. Speaking of whom, he heard a loud chuckle and felt a hand clap him firmly on the back. "Good job, son. Wow. To be honest, I didn't think you could do it." "I didn't," Roland replied quietly. "Say what?" Carl walked over to the tree, inspecting the wild gashes in its trunk that were almost vertical, that appeared self-inflicted. But that couldn't be, he thought. But seeing the axe through the tangled branches and boughs, he saw evidence to the contrary. He turned to Roland, smiling despite his sense of disquiet, and said perhaps a little too cheerfully that they should go rustle up some cheeseburgers. When Roland asked if they shouldn't go get the axe, Carl said no. Let the tree keep it. For the final story in today's episode, a routine medical class makes a horrific discovery. Today they would be introduced to their very first cadavers. A benchmark in any medical student's academic career. Still forms beneath thick white sheets, but their presence imposed a somber weight to the atmosphere. They would most likely be working on these cadavers for a few days, covering various procedures for proper examination and organ removal. Dr. Lucero instructed them to remove the sheets, and the half-dozen or so cadavers were exposed to the halogen light. There were paper bags over their heads and hands, a courtesy to first-timers, as doing so alleviated the sense that these were people and made it easier for them to detach a sympathetic reaction to their state. Even though they had all been around bodies and had observed several autopsies before this, one or two students left in a hurry. Dr. Lucero waited a few minutes for them to either return or just keep walking. They eventually came back in, eyes red and watery from vomiting. She smiled at their sheepish expressions in understanding, quietly letting them know this was a perfectly normal reaction. Jacob was a bit nervous, and could tell his lab partner Angelo was as well. Sure, he had dissected pigs, frogs, human organs even, but he thought it all looks the same once you get in there. He just hated that first cut into something. It was irrational, and perhaps melodramatic. He'd get over it, he thought. And if he wanted to be a practicing medical examiner, he had to. The room was quiet, except for the occasional clattering of a scalpel and solicitous notes taken into their recorders. Jacob was in charge of observations and spoke into his. Subject is Caucasian female, name Jane Doe, approximately 30 years of age, no visible trauma on the body. Initial examination chart indicates COD as asphyxiation. There are no ligature marks or bruising on the neck. Beginning Y incision now. Jacob's hand trembled only slightly as he drew his scalpel, angled down from each point of the collarbones meeting just below the ribs, and down and around the navel. There was some bleeding, more than he expected, but this was common in drowning cases, and he assumed general asphyxiation. They took turns performing various tasks, examining and noting observations as they went. So far, the only thing of note was a slight discoloration of the liver. But Jane Doe was otherwise healthy. As Angelo's scalpel cut into one of the major arteries, Jacob heard a slight scraping, and his eyes darted to Jane Doe's left hand, then back to the fist-size organ that was almost ready to be removed and weighed. When he saw it pump, Angelo let out a choked gasp and tumbled backwards in shock, crumpling to the concrete floor, unconscious. What Jacob and the rest of the class witnessed next would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Her lungs inflated in a sudden intake of breath, and a sound escaped from her mouth in the form of a wheezing scream that sounded like a harsh wind through dead branches. Her body convulsed weakly, and what little blood had been inside her heart's chambers was expelled with enough pressure to spray into Jacob's horrified face. And then she was still. The hours that followed were a cloudy haze for Jacob. He remembered seeing Angelo being wheeled off on a gurney. Apparently, he had suffered a concussion in his fall. After that, it was a procession of faces floating in front of him, administrators, police, asking questions. Neither of them or the school was held liable for the death, and a few days later, an arrest was made for the murder of Kylie Cooper. He was an ex-boyfriend and chemist. The official report on her second autopsy revealed she was put into a death-like state with tetrodotoxin, a powerful neurotoxin found in pufferfish and the blue-ringed octopus. She was then shuffled in with the rest of the cadavers scheduled for the class to autopsy that day. And the worst part of all of this was, Kylie was fully aware of everything that was happening to her before she died. Both times. I'm afraid this is where we say goodbye for now. Until next time. And once again, thank you for listening.